Before we dive into one of the most incredible survival stories you've ever heard, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to witness is the kind of true grit and determination that defined the Wild West. And trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of this unbelievable tale. Now picture this, a man barely clinging to consciousness, his neck shattered in multiple places, riding alone through the merciless desert for over 25 miles with nothing but sheer willpower keeping him in the saddle. And the crazy part is that this isn't some exaggerated legend passed down through generations. This actually happened, and the details of how he survived are going to blow your mind. This is the story of Samuel McKenna, a cattle rancher from New Mexico Territory who, on a scorching July afternoon in 1887, experienced an accident so devastating that any reasonable person would have simply laid down and waited for death. But Sam wasn't reasonable. He was stubborn, maybe even crazy, and that stubbornness is the only reason he lived to tell this tale. Sam McKenna wasn't anybody special, at least not by Wild West standards. He didn't wear a badge, he wasn't a famous gunslinger, and he didn't have any bounties on his head. He was just a 34-year-old rancher trying to make an honest living in the unforgiving landscape of southern New Mexico, working his 100-acre spread about 40 kilometers from the nearest town of Silver Ridge, which back then was barely more than a collection of wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, and a doctor's office that only operated 3 days a week if you were lucky. Sam had been running cattle on that land for almost 7 years, ever since he'd saved up enough money working as a ranch hand for other outfits to buy his own piece of territory. And he'd built everything himself. The cabin, the corral, the water troughs, every single plank and nail represented hours of back-breaking labor under that relentless southwestern sun. He lived alone out there. His wife had died 2 years earlier from pneumonia, and they'd never had children, so it was just Sam and his animals, which included about 80 head of cattle, 3 horses, and a mangy dog named Copper who was better at sleeping than herding, but was good company nonetheless. On the morning of July 16th, Sam woke up like he did every other morning, before dawn, splashing cold water on his face from the basin on his porch and making a pot of coffee so strong it could probably strip paint off wood. And he had plans to ride out to the northern section of his property, where he'd spotted some damaged fencing the previous week, because if you didn't stay on top of fence repairs in cattle country, you'd wake up one morning to find half your herd had wandered off into the desert or onto someone else's land, and either way, you were looking at a significant loss. Sam saddled up his favorite horse, a 9-year-old chestnut mare named Delilah, who had been with him since he'd started the ranch. She was steady, reliable, the kind of horse that wouldn't spook at a rattlesnake or lose her nerve in a thunderstorm, which made her worth her weight in gold in that harsh environment. Sam loaded his saddlebags with fence wire, pliers, some dried beef, a canteen of water, and his rifle, because you never rode out alone without a weapon, not with mountain lions, bandits, and occasional hostile encounters with displaced Apache still being a reality in that part of the territory. The ride out to the northern fence line took about an hour, and Sam spent that time doing what he always did on these solo rides, running through his mental checklist of everything that needed doing on the ranch, calculating how many more cattle he could afford to buy come fall, wondering if he should make the trip into Silver Ridge later that week to pick up supplies and maybe spend an evening at the saloon talking to other human beings for a change, because the solitude of ranch life could wear on a man after a while, even one as independent as Sam. When he reached the damaged section of fence, he dismounted and ground-tied Delilah, which meant dropping her reins and trusting she'd stay put, something she'd done 1,000 times before. and he got to work cutting away the broken wire and stringing new sections, work that required focus, because one wrong move with those fence pliers could slice your hand open faster than you could blink. He'd been at it for maybe 45 minutes, the sun climbing higher and the heat starting to press down on him like a physical weight, when he heard Delilah snort nervously behind him. That particular sound horses make when something's not quite right in their world. Sam straightened up and turned to see what had spooked her, thinking maybe it was a snake or a coyote, but what he saw instead made his blood run cold. 3 riders approaching from the east, moving at a steady pace directly toward him. And out here, unexpected visitors were rarely good news. He recognized the lead rider immediately, a man named Wade Corrigan, who ran a neighboring ranch about 15 miles to the east. And Wade was known throughout the territory as a bully, a cheat, and someone who'd been suspected of rustling cattle from smaller ranchers, though nothing had ever been proven in court. The 2 men with Wade were his ranch hands, rough-looking characters who did whatever Wade told them to do without asking questions. And Sam felt his stomach tighten because he'd had a dispute with Wade 3 months earlier over water rights, where a creek that ran through both their properties had led to heated words and thinly veiled threats. And Sam had hoped that was the end of it, but clearly Wade had been carrying that grudge. Wade reined in his horse about 15 feet from Sam, a cruel smile playing on his lips. And the first words out of his mouth were not friendly, asking Sam what the hell he thought he was doing, fixing fence on land that Wade claimed was actually part of his property, which was complete nonsense because Sam had the deed and the survey maps to prove this was his land, but Wade had never been one to let facts get in the way of what he wanted. Sam tried to keep his voice calm and reasonable, explaining that this was definitely his property and suggesting they could ride into Silver Ridge together and sort it out with the land office if there was any confusion. But Wade wasn't interested in reasonable solutions. He'd come out here with a purpose, and that purpose was intimidation. The confrontation escalated quickly, with Wade becoming more aggressive, his hand dropping to rest on the pistol at his hip in an unmistakable threat. And Sam realized that this situation was about to turn deadly. But before he could even reach for his own weapon, one of Wade's men had circled around behind him. Now here is where most people would expect this to turn into a gunfight, some dramatic shootout like you see in the movies. But that's not what happened. Instead, Wade did something even more vicious. He spurred his horse forward suddenly, and the animal's shoulder slammed into Sam hard enough to knock him completely off his feet, sending him sprawling backward. And in that fraction of a second, Sam's boot caught in a coil of the barbed wire he'd been working with, which twisted his body at an unnatural angle as he fell. The sound of his neck breaking was something the witnesses would later describe in their statements to the territorial marshal, a sharp crack like a dry branch snapping, clearly audible even over the nervous shuffling of the horses. And Sam hit the ground in a twisted heap, his head at an angle that no living person's head should be. And for a moment, everyone just froze, including Wade and his men, because they'd clearly just witnessed what looked like a fatal accident. Sam was conscious, which might surprise you, because most people assume that breaking your neck means instant death, or at least instant unconsciousness, but the reality is more complicated. Depending on exactly which vertebrae are fractured and how the spinal cord is affected, a person can remain conscious and aware, even with catastrophic neck injuries. And that's exactly what happened to Sam. He couldn't move, not at first, lying there in the dirt with his face turned toward the merciless sun. And the pain was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, a white-hot agony that seemed to radiate from the base of his skull down through his entire body. But worse than the pain was the terror, the absolute primal fear that came from realizing he couldn't feel his arms or legs, couldn't make his body respond to his brain's desperate commands to get up, to move, to do something. Through the ringing in his ears and the haze of shock, he heard Wade's voice, panicked now, saying something about how it was an accident, how Sam had lost his balance, and one of the other men suggesting they should help him. But Wade shut that down immediately, saying there was nothing they could do and they needed to get out of there before anyone saw them. Sam tried to call out, to beg them not to leave him there, but his voice came out as nothing more than a rasping whisper, barely audible even to himself, and he watched helplessly as Wade and his men turned their horses and rode away at a gallop, leaving him alone in the dirt with a broken neck and no reasonable hope of survival. The despair that washed over him in that moment was overwhelming. Lying there, unable to move, while vultures circled overhead, already attracted by the possibility of an easy meal, and Sam found himself thinking about his late wife, wondering if he'd be seeing her soon, wondering if dying alone in the desert sun was the fate he'd earned for choosing this hard, solitary life. But then something shifted inside him. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was rage at Wade Corrigan for leaving him to die, or maybe it was just the fundamental human refusal to give up, even in the face of impossible odds. But whatever it was, Sam decided that he wasn't going to die out here. Not like this. Not because some coward had knocked him down and left him for dead. The first challenge was regaining any kind of movement, and Sam focused every ounce of his willpower on his right hand, trying to make his fingers twitch, to curl, to respond in any way. And after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, he felt a tingling sensation, then a burning pins and needles feeling, as some connection between his brain and his extremities began to partially restore itself. Medical experts would later theorize that Sam's spinal cord hadn't been completely severed, just badly compressed by the fractured vertebrae, and that the partial restoration of function was a combination of the swelling temporarily reducing and his body's natural shock response beginning to wear off. But whatever the explanation, Sam gradually regained limited use of his arms, though his legs remained completely unresponsive, dead weight that might as well have belonged to someone else for all the control he had over them. Using his arms, Sam managed to drag himself across the ground, inch by agonizing inch, toward where Delilah stood about 20 feet away, and that horse, bless her loyal heart, hadn't moved despite the commotion and the smell of blood. She just stood there, watching her owner crawl toward her like some kind of broken insect. It took Sam almost 30 minutes to cover that distance, and by the time he reached Delilah's side, he was drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, and fighting waves of nausea and dizziness. But he'd made it. He'd reached his horse, and now came the truly impossible part, getting into the saddle. Under normal circumstances, mounting a horse requires leg strength, coordination, and the ability to pull yourself up using the stirrup and saddle horn. And Sam had none of those things. His legs were useless, his neck was shattered, and any significant movement of his head sent lightning bolts of pain through his entire body. But he'd come this far, and he wasn't about to quit now. Using a combination of arm strength and pure desperate determination, Sam grabbed onto the stirrup and began hauling himself upward. In what should have taken 5 seconds took nearly 20 minutes of struggling, falling back, trying again, each failure bringing fresh waves of pain and exhaustion. But slowly, impossibly, he made progress. He managed to get his chest across the saddle, lying belly down across Delilah's back like a sack of grain. And from there, he used the saddle horn to pull himself further up, his arms shaking with effort, his vision going dark around the edges more than once, until finally, somehow, he was sitting upright in the saddle, though his legs hung uselessly on either side of the horse, and his broken neck made it impossible to hold his head in a normal position. Sam's head lolled forward and to the side, held in place only by his neck muscles that somehow still had some function, and he found that if he tilted his whole upper body, he could maintain enough balance to stay in the saddle, barely, precariously, like a drunk man trying to stay upright. But he was mounted, he was in the saddle, and that meant he had a chance. If you're enjoying this incredible story of survival and you want to see more content about the real heroes of the Wild West, smash that like button right now and leave a comment telling me what you think you would have done in Sam's situation, because honestly, I can't even imagine having that kind of courage and determination. Now, Sam faced the next massive challenge. He needed to get Delilah moving in the direction of Silver Ridge, which was 40 kilometers away, a distance that would take hours to cover, even under ideal circumstances. And these were about as far from ideal circumstances as you could possibly get. The problem was that Sam couldn't use his legs to guide the horse, couldn't apply pressure with his knees or heels the way a rider normally would. And his hands were so weak from the exertion of mounting and the shock to his system that he could barely grip the reins. So he was essentially a passenger, hoping that his horse would somehow understand what needed to happen. Delilah, displaying the intelligence and training that made her such a valuable animal, seemed to sense that something was terribly wrong with her rider. Horses are remarkably perceptive creatures, able to pick up on subtle changes in their rider's breathing, posture, and smell, and she certainly knew that Sam slouching in the saddle with his head hanging at a bizarre angle was not normal behavior. Sam managed to make a clicking sound with his tongue, the universal signal to get a horse moving, and miraculously, Delilah began walking, slowly at first, tentative, as if unsure whether this was really what Sam wanted. But when he didn't rein her in or give any contrary signal, she continued, picking her way across the rough terrain with the careful steps of a horse who knows her rider is in trouble. The journey back toward the ranch and then onward to Silver Ridge became a test of endurance that would have broken most men in the first hour. Every step Delilah took sent vibrations through Sam's broken body, and each jarring movement was like being stabbed with hot knives all along his spine. He couldn't hold his head steady. It bobbed and swayed with the horse's gait, each movement grinding the fractured bones in his neck against each other and sending fresh explosions of agony through his nervous system. And several times in that first hour, Sam came very close to simply letting himself slide out of the saddle, thinking that maybe it would be easier to just lie down in the desert and let nature take its course. But each time that temptation arose, he fought it back, reminding himself that giving up would mean Wade Corrigan got away with what he'd done, and Sam wasn't about to give that bastard the satisfaction. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature soared past 100 degrees, which is brutal even for someone in perfect health, and absolutely murderous for someone in Sam's condition. Dehydration became a serious concern within the first couple of hours. His canteen was still attached to the saddle, but his hands were so weak and uncoordinated that he dropped it the first time he tried to lift it to his lips, watching helplessly as precious water spilled out into the dirt before he managed to get the stopper back in. He could only take tiny sips anyway, because the position of his head made swallowing difficult and dangerous. Every time liquid went down his throat, he risked choking, and choking while alone in the desert with a broken neck would definitely mean death. So he rationed himself to the smallest sips possible, just enough to keep his mouth from being completely dry. knowing that the canteen wouldn't last the whole journey, but hoping he could make it stretch far enough to matter. Delilah, bless her, kept up a steady walking pace, and Sam realized after a while that she was heading in the direction of the ranch without any real guidance from him. Horses have an excellent sense of direction and a strong homing instinct, and Delilah knew where the water trough and the hay pile were, so she was taking them home, which was both good and bad for Sam's purposes. It was good because the ranch was in roughly the same direction as Silver Ridge, so at least they were moving the right way. But it was bad because the ranch was only about 5 miles from where the accident had occurred, and Sam knew that if Delilah stopped at the ranch, he'd never be able to get her moving again. He'd be stuck there, still more than 35 kilometers from any help, and he'd die in his own front yard, which seemed like a particularly cruel fate. As they approached the ranch, Sam summoned every bit of strength he had left and pulled on the right rein, trying to guide Delilah past the turnoff to his property and keep her heading toward Silver Ridge. And amazingly, the horse responded, maybe confused about why they were passing the ranch without stopping, but trusting her rider enough to keep going. And Sam felt a surge of hope, so powerful it almost made him cry, because if Delilah would keep walking, if she'd trust him enough to keep moving past food and water and familiar territory, then maybe, just maybe, they had a chance of making it. The afternoon stretched into early evening, and the pain in Sam's neck, which he'd thought couldn't possibly get any worse, somehow did. The initial shock and adrenaline had worn off completely, leaving him with nothing to buffer the raw, grinding agony of bone scraping against bone with every tiny movement. And he developed a technique of sorts, tilting his entire upper body forward and bracing his head against Delilah's mane, which at least kept his neck from moving quite as much, though it meant he couldn't see where they were going and had to trust entirely in his horse's sense of direction. Hours passed in a haze of suffering. Sam drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes snapping awake with a start when a particularly sharp jolt of pain cut through the fog in his brain, other times fading into a semi-conscious state where he wasn't quite asleep but wasn't fully aware either. And in those twilight moments, his mind wandered to strange places. He thought about his childhood in Missouri before his family had moved west, remembered his mother's voice singing hymns while she worked in the kitchen, recalled the first time he'd kissed his wife under a cottonwood tree along the Rio Grande, and he had fever dreams where he was already dead and his wife was welcoming him to whatever came after. But each time he started to slip too far into those dreams, the pain would snap him back to reality, a brutal reminder that he was still alive, still fighting, still enduring. The sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, and Sam realized they'd been traveling for at least 6 hours, maybe longer. He'd lost track of time somewhere along the way, but he recognized some of the landmarks that were passing, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a crouching lion, a dry creek bed that only ran during the monsoon season. These were features he'd seen on previous trips to Silver Ridge, which meant they were making progress. They were actually covering ground, though Sam had no idea how much further they had to go or whether he could possibly last long enough to reach help. Delilah was showing signs of fatigue now. Her pace had slowed considerably, and she was breathing harder because she'd been walking for hours without water, carrying a full-grown man. And while she was a strong horse, even strong horses have their limits, and Sam worried that she might simply stop, might decide she'd had enough and refuse to take another step. And he had no way to make her continue if she made that choice. Darkness fell across the desert, and this presented a whole new set of problems. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared, which was actually a relief for Sam's overheated body, but it also meant that Delilah was picking her way through increasingly treacherous terrain in the dark, and one wrong step into a gopher hole or a patch of loose rocks could send them both tumbling, and a fall would definitely kill Sam. His body simply couldn't take any more trauma. The moon rose nearly full, providing enough light to see by, and Sam found himself staring at that moon, focusing on it as a way to stay conscious, counting heartbeats, counting breaths, doing anything to keep his mind from shutting down completely. Because he knew that if he passed out now, he might slide off the horse without even knowing it, might wake up lying in the dirt with Delilah long gone, or worse, might not wake up at all. Make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to get to the most unbelievable part of this story, and you're gonna want to share this with everyone you know. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss what happens next. Somewhere around what Sam guessed was midnight, though he had no real way to know, he began to hear sounds that didn't belong in the desert night. The distant barking of dogs, the faint sound of piano music, human sounds, civilization sounds, and at first he thought it was another fever dream, his dying brain creating comforting hallucinations to ease his passing. But the sounds grew louder, more distinct, more real, and then he saw them. Lights, actual lights from windows and lanterns, the scattered buildings of Silver Ridge appearing out of the darkness like a miracle, like salvation, like the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen in his entire life. Delilah smelled the water troughs in town and found a last reserve of energy, picking up her pace to something almost like a normal walk, and they entered the outskirts of Silver Ridge, passing dark, closed businesses and silent houses where people slept peacefully, having no idea that a man with a broken neck was riding past their windows. Sam tried to call out, tried to yell for help, but his voice was barely a croak, weak and pathetic, not nearly loud enough to wake anyone, and he felt despair rising again because he'd come all this way, had endured hours of impossible suffering, and now he was going to die on the main street of town because he couldn't make enough noise to get anyone's attention. But then Delilah, showing once again why she was worth her weight in gold, did something that probably saved Sam's life. She walked directly to the water trough outside the Lucky Dollar Saloon, the only building in town that still had lights burning and people inside, and she whinnied, loud and insistent, the way horses do when they want attention. And that whinny caught the attention of Carl Morrison, the saloon owner, who was in the process of closing up for the night. Carl stepped outside to see who was causing the commotion at this ungodly hour, probably expecting to find some drunk cowboy who couldn't control his horse. But what he saw instead made him freeze in shock. A man slumped in the saddle, barely upright, with his head hanging at an angle that Carl immediately recognized as wrong, terribly wrong. And when Carl got closer and saw that it was Sam McKenna, a man he'd shared more than a few drinks with over the years, he started shouting for help, bellowing at the top of his lungs to wake anyone within earshot. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, people emerging from the saloon and nearby buildings, everyone talking at once, asking what happened, how Sam had gotten into this condition, whether he was even still alive. And Carl took charge of the situation with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of dealing with saloon fights and cowboy emergencies, telling someone to run and fetch Doc Hartley immediately. Doesn't matter that it's the middle of the night, bang on his door until he answers. And telling others to help get Sam down from the horse without moving his neck any more than absolutely necessary. Getting Sam out of the saddle was a delicate operation, and the men who helped knew they were dealing with a serious neck injury, Most of them had seen ranch accidents before and understood that moving someone wrong could turn a survivable injury into a fatal one. So they worked slowly and carefully, supporting Sam's head and neck as best they could while lowering him onto a makeshift stretcher fashioned from a door someone had taken off its hinges. Sam was barely conscious at this point, drifting in a hazy, twilight state where he could hear voices and feel hands touching him but couldn't really process what was happening, couldn't make his mouth form words to answer the questions people were asking him. And part of him wondered if this was actually death, if he died somewhere along the trail and this was just his mind's way of letting go. But the pain was still there, constant and grinding, and he figured death probably shouldn't hurt this much. Doc Hartley arrived about 10 minutes after being summoned. A grumpy, middle-aged man who'd been practicing frontier medicine for 20 years and thought he'd seen everything. But even he was shocked when he got his first look at Sam McKenna, because people with broken necks simply didn't ride 40 kilometers through the desert. It wasn't medically possible. It wasn't physically possible. And yet here was the evidence, lying on a stretcher in front of him. The doctor's examination was quick and professional, checking Sam's pulse, his breathing, gently probing the area around his neck and feeling the unmistakable sensation of bone fragments moving under his fingers, which confirmed his worst fears. This was a severe cervical fracture, possibly multiple fractures, and the fact that Sam was still alive was nothing short of miraculous. But keeping him alive was going to require some serious intervention and a lot of luck. They moved Sam into Doc Hartley's office/surgery, a small building with an examination table, basic medical equipment, and not nearly enough of anything to properly treat an injury this severe. And the doctor was honest with the gathered crowd, telling them that Sam's chances weren't good, that even if he survived the next few hours, he might never walk again, might be paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of his life, assuming he lived long enough to have a rest of his life. Doc Hartley's immediate priority was immobilizing Sam's neck to prevent any further damage to the spinal cord. And in 1887, that meant wrapping him in bandages and splints, creating a crude but effective collar that would keep his head from moving, and then administering laudanum for the pain, which was basically opium dissolved in alcohol, and was pretty much the only serious painkiller available on the frontier. It wasn't great, it was addictive, but it was better than nothing. And Sam definitely needed something because he was still conscious enough to be in absolute agony. The story of Sam McKenna's impossible ride spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire, and by the next morning, everyone in town knew about the rancher who'd ridden 40 kilometers with a broken neck. And the story got even more interesting when Sam, drifting in and out of consciousness thanks to the laudanum, managed to explain what had happened, how Wade Corrigan had confronted him, how Wade's horse had knocked him down, how Wade and his men had left him to die in the desert. And suddenly, this wasn't just an amazing survival story, it was also a crime, attempted murder at worst, criminal negligence at best. And the territorial marshal was going to have some serious questions for Wade Corrigan. Sam spent 3 weeks in Doc Hartley's office, flat on his back, unable to move, his neck held immobile by an increasingly sophisticated series of braces and supports that the doctor constructed as he went along, essentially inventing cervical stabilization techniques on the fly, because there was no textbook for this, no established protocols for treating a patient who shouldn't have survived his injury in the first place. During those 3 weeks, Sam teetered on the edge of death more than once, developing a fever that made the doctors certain he'd die from infection, but somehow he fought through it, then dealing with complications from being immobile for so long. But gradually, impossibly, he began to improve. The swelling around his spinal cord reduced. Sensation began returning to his legs, and about a month after the accident, he moved his toes, which made Doc Hartley actually tear up because he'd been certain that Sam would never walk again. The legal case against Wade Corrigan moved forward, with multiple witnesses coming forward to testify about Wade's reputation for violence and intimidation, and his 2 ranch hands, faced with potential murder charges themselves, turned on him and admitted that Wade had deliberately run his horse into Sam, hoping to scare him or hurt him, though they claimed Wade hadn't intended to kill him. Which was legally irrelevant, because if someone dies or is seriously injured as a result of your criminal actions, you're responsible regardless of your intentions. Wade was arrested, tried, and convicted of assault with intent to commit murder, and he was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, which most people thought was actually pretty light, considering he'd left a man with a broken neck to die alone in the desert. But that was frontier justice, imperfect, but better than nothing.
As for Sam McKenna, his recovery was long and painful. It took him almost 6 months before he could walk without assistance, and even then he had to use a cane. His neck never fully recovered its original range of motion. He couldn't turn his head fully to the left or right for the rest of his life, and he had chronic pain that never really went away. But he was alive. He was walking, and against all odds, he was eventually able to return to his ranch and resume working his land, though he had to hire help because he couldn't do all the physical labor he'd been capable of before the injury. The story of his 40-kilometer ride with a broken neck became legendary throughout New Mexico territory and beyond. Newspapers picked it up, embellished it, turned Sam into a folk hero, and while he never much cared for the attention, he did appreciate that it brought attention to the dangers of land disputes and the need for better law enforcement in remote areas of the frontier. Delilah, the horse who'd carried Sam all those miles and quite literally saved his life by getting him to Silver Ridge, lived out the rest of her days on Sam's ranch, never worked again, just spent her time grazing in the pasture and being spoiled rotten with apples and carrots. And when she died of old age 8 years later, Sam buried her on a hill overlooking his property with a simple wooden marker that read, "Delilah, the bravest horse that ever lived," which, if you ask me, is one of the most touching tributes to an animal you'll ever hear. Sam himself lived another 23 years after the accident, dying in 1910 at the age of 57, which honestly was a pretty good run considering he should have died in 1887. And when he passed, the local newspaper ran an obituary that focused less on his ranching career and more on that incredible day when he'd refused to accept death, had refused to give up, had demonstrated the kind of determination and grit that defined the best of what the American frontier could produce in terms of human character. Now, let's talk about what this story really means. Because it's easy to hear about something like this and think it's just an entertaining tale of survival. But there are deeper lessons here about human endurance, about the power of will, about how sometimes the difference between life and death isn't physical strength or perfect conditions or even medical intervention. Sometimes it's just the stubborn refusal to quit, the determination to keep going even when every rational part of your brain is screaming that it's impossible. Sam McKenna didn't have any special training. He wasn't a soldier or a survival expert. He was just a regular guy who found himself in the worst possible situation and decided that he wasn't going down without a fight. And that decision, That choice to keep trying, even when trying seemed pointless, is what saved his life. Think about that the next time you're facing something difficult. The next time you want to give up on a goal or a dream or a challenge. Remember the man who rode 40 kilometers with a broken neck. Remember that human beings are capable of far more than we think we are when we're pushed to our absolute limits.
The medical aspects of Sam's survival are worth discussing too, because from a modern medical perspective, what he did should not have been possible. The human neck contains 7 vertebrae, and the spinal cord that runs through them controls pretty much everything below your head: breathing, heart rate, limb movement. All of it depends on signals from your brain traveling down through that bundle of nerves. And when vertebrae break, they can pinch or sever that spinal cord, which is why broken necks are so often fatal or result in permanent paralysis. The fact that Sam retained enough function to move his arms, to stay conscious, to maintain his balance well enough to remain in the saddle for hours suggests that his fractures, while severe, must have compressed rather than completely severed his spinal cord. And the swelling and inflammation from the injury probably caused most of his initial paralysis, which gradually improved as the swelling went down over the following days and weeks. Modern neurosurgeons who've studied historical cases like Sam's believe he probably fractured his 5th and 6th cervical vertebrae, which is serious but survivable if the spinal cord itself isn't completely damaged. And his survival probably came down to a combination of incredible luck in terms of exactly how those bones broke, his body's natural healing response, and the fact that he somehow avoided any movement or trauma that would have shifted those fractures in a way that would have severed his spinal cord. But all the medical explanations in the world don't really capture the human element of what Sam did. Don't convey the sheer willpower required to drag yourself across 20 feet of desert, to haul your broken body onto a horse when you can't even feel your legs, to stay conscious and upright in the saddle for 8 or 9 or however many hours it actually took, to not give up when giving up would have been so much easier than continuing to suffer. That's the part of the story that transcends the medical details and enters the realm of pure human spirit. And it's why stories like this resonate with us more than a century later, because they remind us what we're capable of, what potential lies within each of us when we're tested by circumstances that seem insurmountable.
If you've made it this far in the video, do me a favor and leave a comment telling me what you think about Sam McKenna's story. Would you have had the courage and determination to do what he did, or do you think you would have given up? And make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because we've got so many more incredible true stories from the Wild West coming your way. Stories about survival, revenge, justice, and the kind of larger-than-life characters that made the frontier such a fascinating period in American history. These stories deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be told, and your support helps us keep bringing them to you. So subscribe, like, and comment. It really does make a huge difference in helping this channel grow. The legacy of Sam McKenna's ride extends beyond just his own story. It became part of the larger narrative about what frontier life demanded of the people who lived it, about how survival in that harsh environment required not just physical toughness, but mental fortitude, resourcefulness, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The American West was full of stories like Sam's, maybe not quite as dramatic or unlikely, but stories nonetheless of people pushed to their limits and finding reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. And collectively, these stories help explain how settlers managed to establish communities and build lives in places that seemed designed to kill them, whether through hostile climate, dangerous animals, conflicts with indigenous peoples, or simple isolation from medical care and support systems.
Sam's story also highlights the importance of animals in frontier survival, particularly horses, which were far more than just transportation. They were partners, sometimes the difference between life and death. And the relationship between a cowboy or rancher and his horse was built on mutual trust and understanding that went beyond simple training. Delilah's decision to keep walking toward Silver Ridge, to keep carrying her injured rider, even past familiar territory where she could have stopped for food and water, suggests a level of connection and loyalty that's difficult to fully explain. Maybe it was training, maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was something deeper, some bond between human and animal that kicked in when it mattered most. But whatever the explanation, that horse saved Sam's life as surely as if she'd carried him into a hospital. And the fact that Sam recognized this and honored Delilah for the rest of her life speaks to the kind of character he had, the kind of man who understood debt and gratitude and didn't take miracles for granted. The confrontation with Wade Corrigan and its aftermath also tells us something important about frontier justice and the gradual establishment of law and order in territories that had operated under might makes right principles for too long. Wade had probably been bullying smaller ranchers for years, using his larger operation and willingness to employ violence to get his way. And he'd gotten away with it because there weren't enough lawmen to patrol vast territories, and because frontier culture sometimes tolerated a certain amount of rough behavior between neighbors. But Sam's case, particularly the dramatic nature of his survival and his ride, brought attention to the problem and resulted in actual legal consequences for Wade, which was relatively unusual for that time and place. And it sent a message to other bullies and would-be land grabbers that maybe the law was finally catching up to the frontier, that you couldn't just push people around and expect no consequences anymore.
In the broader context of Wild West history, Sam McKenna's story represents the transition period between the truly lawless frontier and the more settled, civilized West that emerged in the 1890s and early 1900s. His accident happened in 1887, which was right in the middle of that transition, and you can see elements of both eras in his story. The violence and isolation and self-reliance of the old frontier combined with the legal system and medical care and community support of the emerging modern West. By 1910, when Sam died, the West had changed dramatically. The frontier was officially closed according to the Census Bureau. Ranches had fences and telephones. Towns had proper hospitals and law enforcement. And the kind of situation Sam found himself in, being left to die 40 kilometers from help with no way to contact anyone, was becoming less and less common as infrastructure and technology caught up to settlement. But even as the Wild West faded into history and eventually into mythology, stories like Sam McKenna's continued to resonate because they captured something essential about human nature, about our capacity for endurance, about the determination that drives us to survive against impossible odds. These weren't stories about supernatural heroes or impossible feats of fantasy. They were stories about regular people, flawed and human, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them. And that's what makes them so powerful, the recognition that maybe we're all capable of more than we think, that maybe when pushed to our absolute limits, we might discover reserves of strength and courage that surprise even us. So as we wrap up this incredible story, I want you to think about what you'd do in Sam's situation. Imagine yourself lying in that desert dirt with a broken neck, knowing you're 40 kilometers from help, knowing that 3 men just rode away and left you to die. What would you do? Would you fight? Would you try to crawl? Would you give up? It's easy to say you'd fight when you're sitting comfortably wherever you are right now, but the truth is that none of us really knows what we're capable of until we're tested.
And hopefully, most of us will never be tested the way Sam McKenna was. But his story exists to remind us that human beings are resilient, that we're survivors, that sometimes the only difference between life and death is the decision to keep trying for one more minute, to endure one more moment of suffering, to refuse to quit, even when quitting makes perfect logical sense. Hit that subscribe button right now if you haven't already. Smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what you thought of Sam McKenna's story, because engagement like that helps this channel grow and means we can keep bringing you incredible true stories from the Wild West, stories about survival, revenge, redemption, and the kind of extraordinary, ordinary people who built America on the frontier. Share this video with your friends, with your family, with anyone who appreciates a good story about human endurance and the indomitable spirit that refuses to be broken no matter what life throws at it. Because stories like this need to be remembered, they need to be told, and they need to be passed down so that future generations understand what their ancestors were capable of, what trials they endured, and what kind of character they possessed. Sam McKenna rode 40 kilometers with a broken neck, defied medical impossibility, survived what should have been certain death, and lived another 23 years to tell the tale, which is one of the most remarkable survival stories to come out of the American West, and it's a privilege to share it with you today. Remember his name, remember his story, and remember that when life pushes you to your limits, you might be surprised by just how much further you can actually go if you refuse to quit. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll dive into another incredible story from the Wild West that you won't want to miss.